I'm sure you've heard that Europe has deployed the strategy of de-risking its trade from China. So what is this de-risking all about? Is this EU a mammoth regional bloc that has fallen far too deep into its trade dependence with Beijing that things like de-risking won't work? Or is it that the EU has never been more serious to ensure economic security by checking overexposure and reliance on a single source and is resolute on protecting strategically sensitive trade and investments as well as committed to reducing its massive trade deficit from China? Let's try to understand this a little better. Actually, the phrase de-risking from China is quite commonly used but is often misunderstood by the outside world. At the outset, it neither amounts to the bloc cutting out trade ties with China, nor does it pertain to business as usual. Both these extremes miss the larger point of making trade sustainable. Today's global trade has and will become more strategic, transcending the simpler era of profit chasing, or what is often referred to as the era of cowboy capitalism. But the truth is constantly evolving and as of now lies somewhere in the grey zone. The European Union has come a long way from its first generation economic security strategies that operated in a simpler world. It also operated on the simpler assumption that trade interdependence would integrate China into the global system as a responsible stakeholder and eventually democratize it. Nothing could be farther from truth, as China has evolved into a stricter version of authoritarianism in the last decade under Xi, and EU finds its industries overexposed and over-reliant on China with a trade deficit of a whopping $400 billion. Therefore, it is imperative that now the bloc's efforts are as cross-sectional as the complex challenges it seeks to tackle. So today's EU policy towards economic security is a marked departure from some years ago when the enthusiasm around comprehensive investment agreement with Beijing was pretty high and European companies were keen to step up investments in China. They still are, but they are taking a far more cautious approach. So waking up to this post-cowboy capitalist space has surely come with costs that the bloc is struggling to bear. National interests of member countries, particularly major economies like Germany, often comes in the way of EU's collective economic maneuvers. For instance, German companies continue to invest heavily in China despite the German government's directives to reduce the exposure and an unprecedented collapse in investment guarantees. So just to give you a sense of the figures, in 2023 alone, Berlin's efforts to end over-reliance on China has been noticeable. From 740 million euros in guarantees issued in 2022, the figures have plummeted to 1/10 already this year. But this is still a small step in tackling dangers of over-reliance on a single source. Reconciling mutually exclusive interests between Brussels bureaucrats and powerful business lobbies is a work in progress and, like I said, is likely to remain in the grey zone. But on the whole, Brussels' evolving approach to de-risk its economy in an ambivalent world needs to be understood for its instruments, future projections, and finally, what such diversifying might mean for India. So to begin with, China has been described as a systemic rival and a partner. European disillusionment with China is becoming more palpable over the years. There are long-standing unresolved concerns over unfair competition from Chinese firms, Chinese influence operations in Europe, and human rights violations in Xinjiang, and those have been exacerbated by China's rigid stance on Russia's war in Ukraine, and more than anything else, Beijing's tacit support to Moscow. Then there's also growing risk of conflict over Taiwan. European think tanks are spending sufficient time and resources to study potential scenarios in case of a war in the Straits, because that would be a huge blow to trade ties with China. However, despite all that geopolitical tension and geostrategic premonition, complete decoupling incontestably will choke the global economy in different ways. So de-risking is several shades less radical than decoupling. But de-risking too, although agreed in principle, is not finding takers in member states' industrial lobbies, especially German firms. German companies have enhanced trade ties with China by shifting their production bases to the latter as energy costs have become unsustainable due to the Ukraine war and due to the cost of hurried diversifying away from cheap Russian pipeline gas and oil. I have written a lot on how industrial closures have added to growing signs of stress in Europe's economy after the Ukraine war. Take a look at that as well. So, is Germany really that nonchalant about its trade with China that it doesn't care about what the EU really says? Actually, it's quite the contrary. Germany was also one of the first European nations to start the China mapping exercise in 2018. The revelations of the mapping exercise, later echoed by similar endeavors by other member states like France, a prominent one, showed a worrisome pattern of China exerting influence through the proliferation of Confucius institutes across Europe and simultaneously creating dependencies on itself that made diversification very costly and difficult whenever it was to be attempted. Ironical that China's huge manufacturing miracle was made possible by the large exports of sturdy and precise German tools. Therefore, by the time Europeans and especially the Germans realized that China is not such an open place to do trade, almost half of Europe's burgeoning trade with China was actually by Germany alone, and the cost to diversify had risen steeply. The risk-averse approach is understandable and can also be seen in the case of Italy that was in news recently for withdrawing from China's BRI. Italy was the only G7 nation to have signed up for the BRI in 2019. But bitter experiences were waiting in the wings for Rome, as in the years that followed, Italy's trade deficit with China rose to $20 billion, while trade increased from $50 billion to $80 billion, but all of that went to China's advantage. To make matters worse, the promised resources for BRI projects never met their schedules either. That said, Italy is well aware of the humongous trade it has with China and wishes to replace its BRI involvement with a fairer trade deal. In fact, Giorgia Meloni will be traveling to Beijing soon. So the takeaway here is yes to trade, but no to dependencies and deficits. Now, let's discuss the EU's economic security strategy. Presently, Europe is working on effective implementation of its evolving toolkit for de-risking. When I say a toolkit, I mean certain instruments. When von der Leyen unveiled Europe's economic strategy in June this year, she summed it up as EU's efforts for promoting competitiveness, protecting from risks, and partnering, which means diversifying based on trust. So this strategy basically provides a political framework to a set of evolving and refining ongoing measures and paves the way for more complex proposals in due course. So as the first step towards de-risking, Europe is devising a map for ensuring and improving its competitiveness via what is called the STEP, or the Strategic Technologies for Europe platform, with plans for a €160 billion investment. And this is not a standalone initiative, but it is supported by other initiatives like the Horizon Europe to support innovative scientific research, then through Next Generation EU to ensure the unfinished recovery from the pandemic. Further, STEP will also be complemented by the Green Deal Industrial Plan that aims for a clean tech revolution and digital transition. Finally, the European Union also has detailed plans for upskilling its workforce. These plans are one side of de-risking. The other side of de-risking is the constantly evolving instruments known as the EU toolkit that I was just referring to. So in a parallel development to all I described above, the EU has developed a range of instruments to de-risk its trade and investments. These include tools for screening its outbound and inbound investments, something that has been pretty unprecedented. The regulation for screening the FDIs came into October 2020. The screening tool is supported by another regulation called the Foreign Subsidies Regulation, which entered into force on 12th of January 2023 and aims to address distortions caused in the single market while ensuring a level playing field for all companies operating in the single market. Exploring the toolkit further, there are tools to ensure export control on dual-use items. This has been a work in progress for long. The blog has engaged in extensive export control regimes for a decade. Upgraded regulation with tightened controls have entered into force in September 2021, and it is constantly evolving. Complementing the above, the EU aims to make its international trade more fair and equitable by a regulation for an International Procurement Instrument, or IPI. This is aimed at improving reciprocal access to international procurement and has entered into force last year in August. The IPI gives the EU a greater leverage to get access to public procurement markets outside the EU, boosting opportunities for EU companies. Next is perhaps the best known effort on protecting its digital security via the EU Toolbox for 5G Security. Endorsed by the EU Commission in January 2020, it is a document that is constantly updated as well. Finally, a mention must be made of EU's anti-coercion instrument, which was first proposed in 2021, and it will enter into force in 2023 October. And this is also a direct result of China's coercion of Lithuania over Taiwan, and when China had attacked the single market character of the bloc. Coming back to the original question of making these measures more effective, while updating them is definitely key, but EU will also have to tone down its rhetoric for strategic autonomy. You may have heard of this several times when hearing the French leaders' debates on EU's role in the world, etc., etc. However, better impact can be expected from these de-risking strategies when coordinated with the US, the bloc's transatlantic partner. Remember that the US-EU combined trade with China is flabbergastingly humongous. To put it numerically, $700 billion for China-US trade and $847 billion for EU-China trade. And if you combine that, it's about $1.5 trillion worth of trade. So this coordination is already visible in EU's alignment with US chip export controls and negotiations on an EU-US deal on critical raw materials. Now, just as a caveat, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to imagine that this policy from the West might also invoke a risk of retaliatory measures from Beijing. Let's see how Beijing responds. Just a few days ago, the EU has banned the sale of electric vehicles produced in China into Europe on grounds of unfair subsidies being given to Chinese firms by the CCP. Until the investigation is complete, they have banned the sales. The EU has also slapped tariffs on Chinese steel or aluminium and is now eyeing the sensitive medical technology sector, where Brussels argues it has opened its markets further than China has. In fact, only a day ago, EU trade chief was in Beijing to do some difficult talks over China's trade practices. But despite all attention being on China, it is crucial to understand that EU's de-risking is not only aimed at China. All these policies have global definitions, but in practice, they will have a specific meaning for Beijing. Once in place and when coordinated enough with the US, they will have an impact on the nature of EU's trade with the Asian economic giant, because that is where most of the risky dependencies are. Now, let's shift our focus and ask a relevant question. What does all this mean for India? So while the EU is one of the topmost trading partners of India with the promising connectivity projects, one recently launched at the G20 summit and famously known as the IMEC, Netherlands and Germany are the only two EU countries that figure in the top 10 FDI investors in India in 2023. The only famous diversification that we have seen in the post-pandemic world has actually come from Apple making its iPhones in India. Why aren't the Europeans investing more? The total investment has risen, definitely, but it's still far from the potential it holds. If you remember, India and the EU recently set up what is called the Trade and Technology Council to smoothen out these issues around investment. The currently negotiated investment agreement between the two sides, India and European Union, also holds immense potential for Brussels and New Delhi. The aim of this particular negotiation is to provide a predictable and secure investment environment through commitments on protection against expropriation without compensation and unfair treatment of investors and their investments. It also seeks to put in place an effective dispute settlement mechanism to enforce such rules. By and large, EU's trade with India, like elsewhere, will also be guided by its newly put together economic security strategy. Needless to say, there is more work to be done when it comes to India being a direct beneficiary of EU diversifying its investments from China. I will be back to discuss that and other geopolitical issues from a very complex world today. Stay tuned.